Hi, g'day, mate. 40 here with my buddy Richard. We're going to talk about a book that was published in 2018, Lost Connections, Why You Are Depressed, and How to Find Hope in Some Unexpected Solutions. Richard, overall, I just found this a beautiful book, subtitled Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. In short, the solution is connection. Connection with nature, connection with other people, connection with our better selves. And he's not a religious man, but I would add that many people find benefit from connection with a higher power. But beautiful book. I would strongly recommend it. What's your overall reaction to this book?
After we talked about it and I said, I'd like to discuss it, I read it again. I already had read it twice. It's a very insightful book in many respects, and that his research is really good. I agree with everything that you've said. And I remember the first time that I was exposed to him was his TED Talk. And he made this very strong statement. Everything you know about addiction is wrong. That's the way he put it. And he went on to explain why that was true. And, he said the answer to addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. And that's the case that he's really, taking it on to make. And I think he makes that case fairly well in this book. There's a couple of things I would probably want to pick apart, but I'd rather focus on the positive things first, because I think they're really worthwhile.
Yeah, let's go to page 74. Being lonely seems to cause as much stress as being punched by a stranger. And I think that's profoundly true. And I notice it particularly when going for a walk. If I just go for a walk on my own, the time can drag. And even walking a mile can seem like a drag. On the other hand, if I'm with someone that I enjoy, then walking 5 miles is no problem. And so just extend that metaphor into the rest of life. That if you go to work and you like the people you work with, no matter if you don't particularly enjoy the work that you're doing, as long as you enjoy being around the people in your workplace, you're going to have a much better time at work, as opposed to going into a work where you have no meaningful connection with anyone. Do you want to expand on this?
Well, there's nothing quite as unpleasant as a hostile workplace. Where you dread going to work because you don't like people there, whether you like the work or not. That's true. And he defines loneliness in a particular way in this book. It's being isolated, but in a much larger sense. It's being isolated from connection, from the purpose that comes with those connections, and the sense of that your life has meaning, that gives you well-being. All of those things are grouped into this idea of being lonely. And so he goes on to say, in fact, you said loneliness is not a matter of having people around, it's ingrained wiring in one's brain. There's no external solution to loneliness. Loneliness isn't the physical absence of other people, he said. It's the sense you're not sharing anything that matters with anyone else. And I think that gets down to something that gets down a layer deeper to me. That's what's really interesting, because he digs into that in a lot of meaningful ways.
Yeah. So if you've been around people and they don't care for your presence, that's an incredible form of loneliness. I remember I used to tell my therapist many years ago, sometimes when I go to synagogue, I wonder if anyone there cares about me. And my therapist responded, well, do you care about anyone there? And that really helped me. That really kind of opened my mind. And so I've often had the incredibly dispiriting experience of seeing some people at a social function who are having a good time and they're talking to each other, and I go over and join them, and they have no interest in my being there. Like I say something and there's just dead air, or they just kind of move on and ignore me. So if anyone else has had that experience where you're trying to connect with a group or just trying to participate in a group and they don't want you, you're going to feel incredibly alone. So learning to navigate other people and to find people with whom you can make some kind of common cause, that's the path out of loneliness. Would you like to elaborate on anything?
Yeah, I think that's that's the point that he makes, that it's not simply being isolated, because you know, in during this pandemic, for example, I mean, I haven't seen a lot of my friends. I don't feel lonely at all, not even a little bit. I feel very connected to the things that matter to me. I feel very connected to, what I feel my life's purpose is. And, so to me, at least that's what I picked up from his definition of loneliness. It's not merely the absence of people or not feeling like you fit in. And, it's interesting. If you're trying to fit in with those people, well, they reject you, they're saying, well, you don't mean anything to us. That's that human connection where we have a sense of meaning. If we have a sense, or that other people value us, that's, I think, really down to the core. We want to be valued. Now he gets into, what's happened in our society, and the source of depression and anxiety is that we've picked the wrong things, or we've been told, so he says, the wrong things to value, having status, having money, having, material possessions. Those are the things that make us valued and acceptable to others. And his criticism of that is profound. And I mostly agree with him.
Yeah, I often tell sponsees what I was told by my sponsor and try to be in the middle of the herd. So, for example, if somebody goes to a 12-step meeting, usually there's fellowship afterward. And I rarely went along to the fellowship, but my sponsor would tell me, go to the fellowship, connect with other people, be in the middle of the herd. Don't sit off to the side, don't stand off to the side. You're there to be in the middle of the herd, because when you're off to the side, you're much more likely to be picked off, just like on the savannah. If you're out there on your own, the lion and the tiger is much more likely to come get you. But if you're in the middle of the herd, you're much safer. And I notice a lot of people in recovery, or with people with predilections to depression, they tend to stand off to the side.
Yeah. The instinctive part of that, he mentions that about the savannah, and he puts it this way: nature is connection. Now imagine if on those savannas you became separated from the group and you were alone for a protracted period of time. It meant you were in terrible danger. You were vulnerable to predators, you get sick, nobody would be there to nurse you, and the rest of the tribe was more vulnerable without you too. So you'd be right to feel terrible. There's an urgent signal that says there's something wrong here. And I think that's wired very deep. Human beings are vulnerable. We don't have big claws. We don't have big teeth. A chimpanzee who is, maybe a third smaller than we are, could tear a man from limb to limb if he was so inclined. They're incredibly strong compared to us. So we're not that strong. We don't have all kinds of physical defenses. Where we really have power, and why we become the dominant species on the planet, is precisely because of our ability to cooperate, to work together on a scale that, other than bees and ants, you don't see it anywhere. And bees and ants have very specific, little jobs that they get to do. Ants are the sanitation engineers. Bees make sure that the food grows. I mean, that's their job. I remember in the movie Cold Mountain. I don't know if you ever see that movie.
Yes.
The scene with the old woman who says, Birds got a job, seeds got a job, shit's got a job, everybody's got a job. And there's something really wise about that. And if we're not connected to that, we're not connected to a sense of purpose. And in human beings, it's the purpose that's expressed in our communities. That's where we find that purpose. When we're not connected to that, then we're in trouble.
Yeah, there's since the Enlightenment, there's been this dominant perspective that we're primarily individuals who are born into the world with certain inalienable rights, and I just don't find that a useful way of looking at reality. The traditional way of looking at reality is that we are born as members of a family, an extended family, a tribe, or a nation. That a nation and a tribe, they're simply one big extended family. And then whatever rights and responsibilities we have will be decided by our family, our extended family, depending on the situation. And so in cohesive societies, people aren't looked at primarily as individuals. They're looked at primarily as members of families or extended families. And so there are some benefits from the individualist Anglo-Saxon perspective on life, but I think it misses that we're really born to operate as members of a tribe or a nation. And if we don't literally have a tribe to belong to, we can find our tribe. For example, I love living in a big city because pretty much every night I can find some kind of writer gathering. So I enjoy spending most of my spare time with fellow writers. And you can really only do that in a big city. So fellow writers are my tribe. And then people who like to study Torah, they are particularly my tribe. And then people who share my emotional addictions and they're in recovery, they're members of my tribe. So we have to find our tribe. Any thoughts, Richard?
Yeah, that is really one of the areas where I found that I think he didn't pursue this as deeply as he could have. And it's there because I think there needs to be a balance between the collectivist and the individualist. We are individuals that operate within a collective society. You can go, if you go too far to one extreme or too far to the other extreme, you get problems. What you want is the balance. See, because one of the problems in a collectivist society is, basically you do what you're told. And what we know from even some of the studies that they've done, if you don't feel you have a certain autonomy, that's when you become depressed. There's a certain amount of that that's actually necessary for flourishing. So, and that was that in the Enlightenment, that perspective, though not entirely new, really came to the forefront. And Locke and Hume and the rest of them really kind of made a very strong case, which had a lot to do with why America is the way it is and why we value the individual. But I think that, for me at least, the challenge here, I'll give you an example. In China, they do synchronous sack races. In other words, everyone gets together in a line and they go in perfect order all together down the field. And if they don't stand in line, they're or if they don't succeed, they're shamed, shunned, or other things. If they don't perform for the collective. And I think that's the downside of collectivism. And here in this country, the idea of political correctness, that this one group has this right idea, and if you don't have that right idea, you don't belong. I think that's one of the other really difficult aspects of collectivism, is that you have to identify to belong. But I think there's where I think really human flourishing lives is in the balance between that, is in realizing that you have individual gifts and that those are valuable to the collective. It's your responsibility to develop them. It's your responsibility to share them with the collective for what is, useful for the collective whole. Is to be a contributing member.
Yeah, and there are many challenges, however, in living in community or living with other people. So, one thing
Yeah.
I like about the traditional orientation to life is that it's not primarily about rights. It's primarily about responsibilities. Like
Yes.
if you're a member of a normal family, your parents don't drill into you, here are your rights. If you're a member of a traditional tribe or any traditional group, the leaders of the group are not drilling into you, these are your rights. Instead, what's drilled into you, these are your responsibilities, which is, I think, a much more effective way to go through life. Now, if you're going to live with other people, one thing that you need is integrity, which means you want the various spheres of your life to, if not work together, at least not actively contradict each other. So I've always lived a very split up life where I'd be horrified at the prospect frequently of introducing people in one segment of my life to people in another segment. So integrity comes from the word one, meaning you really want the different spheres of your life to at least not actively contradict. So, for example, in private one-on-one conversations, I like to say really provocative things to a very limited number of people. Now, I would not want these comments broadcast, but it works with those very limited number of people. I have a certain type of humor that is not going to be enjoyed by most people. So if I can limit the broadcast of that humor to people who enjoy it, then it doesn't actively contradict the other segments of my life. So you want to be able to earn a living in a way that you can tell people about, right? You want it to be both legal and upstanding. So there are legal ways to earn a living that you don't really want to tell other people about, and that's not really a life that works. And so you want the way that you conduct yourself in, say, the religious sphere of your life or your hobbies to not actively contradict, say, your family life and your recovery life. And that's the challenge, particularly for people new in recovery, because they're often used to leading an incredibly disjointed life. So, any thoughts on integrity?
Well, see that now integrity comes back to individual responsibility. That's something that only the individual can do. What's interesting about that is I don't know about everybody else, but some people would say, well, you don't want to feel guilty, and I would disagree if that guilt is a signal that there's something wrong in a relationship. I think that kind of guilt is actually useful because it points out that something is wrong in the relationship. And I think when it all comes down to it, at least for me, integrity means what I say is who I am. And there's obviously always a negotiating of that. It's like I may feel certain things and I may have certain things, but and I want to communicate that to other people. Of course, you can't tell, like you're saying about your sense of humor. You can't do everything with everybody because that just won't work. And you have to have a sense of what's appropriate, but you need to be responsible for who you are. And you know, it says love your neighbor as yourself. And to me, what that means is you have to respect yourself and respect your neighbor in the same way. In other words, the way you would respect yourself, you would respect your neighbor. The way you would, take care of yourself is related to how you would take care of somebody else. So that, and I think integrity starts to head into that area. It has to do, because I think, and it's a religious concept that it's not very popular today, it's called righteousness. But what righteousness really means is the rightness of our relationships. a father who is righteous takes good care of his children, provides for them. And it's not that it's a self-importance or a self-righteousness. It has to do with I'm doing the right thing for my role in that relationship. That's what that really is. And that goes back to personal responsibility, I think.
So I'm thinking about they often say in the workplace they talk about sex politics or religion. And so I know that for me, I have a lot of opinions on politics, but in a working environment or in other select environments, I only want to share my hot button controversial opinions with people who'll enjoy them. So even in, say, a right wing circle where people share, say, many of my right wing tendencies, I'm not going to freely broadcast my opinions because that's going to create, say, some distance or disconnection. I really only want to share them with people who will enjoy them. So, one thing that I've learned through recovery is that by getting the mindset of I want to be of service, that I accept being a worker among workers, that I don't need to be the leader of the pack. I don't need to stand out and be constantly seeking attention anymore. But then that enables me to naturally calibrate the things that I say and do to my audience. So if I have, say, left wing friends, I'm only going to say things about politics that they're going to laugh at, right? I'm not going to drive them crazy. And so if I know someone's a Pittsburgh Steelers fan in football, I'm not going to make, derogatory comments about the Steelers unnecessarily to distance myself from other people. So when you develop this orientation of getting along with other people because you either want to be of service to other people or at least you don't want to actively harm or hurt them, then it enables one to begin to calibrate, because I've had a lifelong problem of unnecessarily provoking people. And I had therapists who would try to remind me that when you deliberately offend someone, you're hurting them. And I would just think it was funny. And so it's taken a long time for me to kind of rein back my desire to provoke to that very selective audience who I know there's a very high likelihood that they're going to just laugh out loud when I say something provocative. So learning to live in community while not completely sanitizing yourself, on the other hand, not causing unnecessary pain and dislocation to other people has been a long journey for me. Any thoughts, Richard?
Yeah, it's realistic. This holiday season, for years we've had this kind of ongoing political debate between saying Merry Christmas or saying Happy Holidays. And there's one side of the aisle that says, well, you don't want to offend anybody by saying Merry Christmas and assuming that that's what they celebrate. You should say Happy Holidays, so that, and of course, the people on the other side who would want to say Merry Christmas and were used to saying that go, well, wait a minute. One, you're taking away my rights, but two, what that really reflects is a significant shift in our society, to frankly what would be what many people would call a post-Christian or post-Judeo-Christian era. And I think that's what that's reflecting. But there's something in that I experimented with this year. It was fascinating what happened. What I did was, rather than saying Happy Holidays or saying Merry Christmas, I looked at somebody and in a really congenial tone said, by the way, what are you celebrating this season? And if some different people have different answers. Some people say, oh, I celebrate Christmas. Some people say I celebrate Hanukkah. One woman said, well, I don't celebrate anything. And in every case I went, great. I want you to enjoy that fully. And some people would ask me, what do you celebrate? And one person said, Happy Holidays to me. And I said, didn't you want to ask me what I celebrate?
Yeah.
But I did it in a really fun way. She got a laugh out of it because she saw that there was something really different happening there. And I think, to me, what I learned from doing that is that, this whole thing of having a fight about should we say happy holidays or should we say Merry Christmas, that misses the whole point. The whole point is, if you're interested in that other person and you want to wish them a joyful or a happy season, you kind of want to know what you want to wish it to them for, don't you? See, and just saying Merry Christmas sort of avoids the relational, the little bit of a, discomfort of taking the risk of saying, hey, what do you celebrate? And I think it takes a certain amount of relational skill to be able to do that in a way that isn't perceived as being offensive, because it isn't meant as offensive, but that if it doesn't quite hit people right, that you can put them at ease. You can ease that discomfort that they might have. I didn't really experience anybody having discomfort. However, being a career salesperson, you kind of learn how to put people at ease. That's a skill that gets developed. You learn to recognize where people are. So, but I think that was really fascinating to me, and I think as a society, we need to head more in that direction. We need to not say, well, we think we should be this way, and I think it should be that way. I think what we really most need to learn is how to incorporate that diversity. And I will say that conservatives have a tougher time with that than people on the other side. They do. It's got to be this way. It tends to be something that you would hear a conservative say more than you would hear somebody as a progressive or a liberal say.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
Yeah. So what you're referring to is you're taking other people into account, and
Yes.
you're allowing them to have an effect on you. So
Yeah.
so it's not that you're necessarily reading their mind, but you're picking up on their body language. So I'm extending it beyond just Christmas versus Happy Holidays. But
That was just an example. Yeah.
yeah, so if you're interacting with someone and they look absolutely defeated in their body language, if appropriate, you can know it looks like you're having a tough day. You don't say, you just take that into account when you interact with them. If you're interacting with someone who seems giddy, then you're going to speak to them in a somewhat different way. If you're interacting someone whose body language looks determined, then you take that into account. If you're interacting with someone who's laughing, you take that into account. If you're interacting with someone whose body language screams "Leave me alone," for example, they've got headphones in, then you take that into account. So it's not a big deal. It's not that you require mind reading. It's just that you take other people's state into consideration, and you react to them accordingly.
And that's true. And that didn't, for me at least, I can't speak for anybody else, but for me, that required a certain amount of training and conscious effort. My mom always used to say, "You're thoughtless and inconsiderate," and she was right. When I was younger, it was definitely true. And this is really about that whole idea of being considerate of other people. That's a huge thing. And when you're focused on your rights, or when you're focused on making the other person wrong because they don't agree with you, you're missing out on that whole realm of the human experience, which is where the richness is, which is where the real value is, to me.
Right. I had a coach suggest to me that I try to go a month without provoking anyone. And I think I went 2 weeks or so, and there were women that I would see on a regular basis who'd complained that I'd become really boring. And so I needed to calibrate myself so that I would give them a little bit of teasing. So when I do that, though, I want to take into account whatever their body language says. If they look, absolutely deflated or angry or upset, I don't want to come in there with some teasing. But if they look, normal or even upbeat, then that's the time to come in there with a little song or a little joke. So it's a matter of calibrating myself to other people's to other people's state. So go ahead.
And it's interesting that in that whole loneliness or connected state, when you're focused on what's happening with other people, you're naturally going to be more connected because you're indicating that you're open to that connection, and people pick up on that. When you feel like, oh, I'm isolated, they're not doing this for me, how come they don't like me, and that whole conversation, that literally is a wall that's hard for people to get past. And in our society, we do a lot of that. We have a lot of that kind of people who grow up in situations where that's what they learned and that's all they know, so they don't really know how to think of themselves and other people in a way that promotes really healthy relationships.
So I have a personality tendency. I like to make people laugh, but if I let that have too much free reign, then I can absolutely exhaust people, right? So even a beautiful thing like making people laugh, you can absolutely exhaust people. So you don't have to make them laugh every time you see them. So I learned to kind of tune myself in. And in my experience, it's not a huge calibration. Like I don't have to spend a whole lot of brain power thinking about others. We're just talking about using 5% of my brain power. Let's say 95% of my brain is composing what I want to say to someone. And if I'd simply allow 5% of my brain left over to at least see if there's a red light, a yellow light, or a green light in the other person's expression before I say what I want to say. And then for other people, I know they don't like unnecessary words. So for those people, I just really turn down the volume of my personality to what's simply necessary. And then other people, I don't particularly like them. So I found that my life has been considerably enhanced if I don't begin interactions with certain people. That if they want to interact with me, I always leave it to them. I don't even say good morning, good afternoon, hi, how are you, how was your weekend? I say nothing to them, and I leave it entirely to them whether or not they want to interact. Because for some people, I say good morning, they'll come back at me with what's good about it. And so it's a dance. Did you have any thoughts?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. That dance, as I've shared with you, I'm writing a book that's really about that dance. It's really about the skill set needed to really be able to deal with people who are different than us and find the common ground, find the productive opportunities that we have together, as opposed to what we try to do by ourselves because we can feel more in control or feel whatever comfort we tend to feel when we get to do things the way we think they should be, and really coming past that into this greater opening, where as we take ideas from other people, we begin to see that that's actually more powerful. It's really it's kind of like the group conscience in 12-step. I learned this principle through that, very much so. I used to go into like a committee meeting or something like that, and I said, I have an idea, and it's a really great idea, and I propose it and make a motion and we discuss it. And then as I discussed it, and as I really listened to what other people were saying, I found that sometimes my opinion about what was right changed for what turned out being a better outcome for that group as a whole. And learning how to interact that way. It's something that he talks about, that to bring it back to Lost Connections. In the later part of the book, he talks about the restoration to meaningful work in the bicycle shop, where the transition from this hierarchical job where the boss said you do it this way, to where some of the people from that bike shop went and started a cooperative where they all took responsibility for the job at hand. They all took responsibility for creating benefit for the customers of the company and for having the company work. It wasn't just the boss's responsibility, it was all of their responsibility. But that requires something of people. And when you tell most people that, they go, oh, that would never work, because most people don't want to think, and most people don't want to confront people that they disagree with or those difficulties. But that's a very powerful thing. And for me at least, where I was really exposed to it over a protracted period of time was in my 12-step service, where time and time again I saw how listening to everybody and not trying to force compromise, but to really recognize where the consensus is. And now this gets to that whole thing of what's more important, the individual or the collective, is when you allow everyone to be fully who they are, back to the integrity, to be fully what they bring, to bring it, and to have it accepted, not rejected, but not necessarily adopted until there's substantial agreement that it's really the right thing. And that's a process. It's a difficult process. I call it the 9-legged sack race. That's what I call it. I have a reason I call it that. And I don't know if we have time to go into that, but it's the willingness to engage with other people on that level. And oftentimes they're strangers or people we get to know through that process. But let's say, for example, in the workplace, and one of the points that he makes in the book is that we spend a huge part of our life in the workplace. So the workplace is something we got to get right. And if the workplace isn't right, and a lot of workplaces aren't, he mentions this too, and this is something that I have been aware of. Gallup does a study twice a year about what they call employee engagement. And what they find is, about 30% of employees are actually engaged at their job. The other 70s, and it varies, year over year. Some years it'll be, 28%. Some years it'll be 35%. Some years it'll be 30%. Because they interview different companies, and they've done something close to 30 million, employee interviews and surveys. But what they find is, and it kind of falls into this, 70%, 2 out of 3 are disengaged. They go to job, hold their nose, collect a paycheck, and go home. They hate what they do. They hate their workplace. They hate their job, period. In Europe, it's actually worse. Hari quotes it that it's 87% in Europe. So it's actually worse there than it is here in the United States, which I think, being that 15% is a pretty significant effect in sociological circles, that kind of a percentage says something. And I think part of that is because we have more individualism here. I think that's part of why we have somewhat more satisfaction than they do there, because in Europe you have much more of a collectivist idea, and I think that depresses people.
Now, if you're going to live a life around other people, it is essential to compare yourself and notice what's going on. It's essential for survival to notice what other people are doing. It's essential for information, because I know from my experience, other people often know much more efficient and effective ways of doing things. So I might be struggling with something, and then I'll ask, hey, how did you do this task? And I find out a much easier and effective way of doing it. And so information, we need information. So we need to compare and notice what's going on with our peers. We need safety. So being connected with other people helps us to be safer. And we need connection, right? So we need to notice what's going on with others, and that's going to, however, bring up a very human tendency to compare and despair. So
I was looking at that. I saw your note from earlier in the month about that.
Yeah, it's so for some people say, "Oh, stop comparing your insides to other people's outsides," and that is a good point. But it is absolutely essential to compare yourself to other people. You do need to do this. You can't escape this. You can't become so spiritual that you don't notice what other people are driving, how other people are living, how other people are earning, where are they investing their money, what recreational activities are they taking part in, where are they going on vacation, what art are they buying, what books are they reading. It's imperative to compare yourself to others so that you can learn. On the other hand, it's very easy to get into compare and despair, to get into envy or scorn. So envy is when we want to take what someone above us has. We feel like that belongs to us. It's distinct from jealousy, where we're afraid that they will take something we have. Then scorn is where you look at people below you as essentially they don't matter, they don't count. So either of those stances does not help. So there are ways to deal with the challenge of envy and scorn, and I'm just going to suggest a couple and then throw it over to you. So you can transmute envy into inspiration. You can allow what other people are accomplishing and allow that to inspire you. Two, you can look at what other people are doing, and if you feel like you're on the same team, that you're part of the same tribe, then you can feel joy, vicarious joy in other people's accomplishments. And as far as scorn, recognizing that but for the grace of God go I. But any thoughts on how to deal in a world where it's absolutely imperative, you cannot get away from continually comparing yourself to other people. At the same time, you don't want to fall into compare and despair.
Well, it's interesting. In the book, he actually has a chapter about that. Did you remember? You recall which chapter I'm speaking about?
No, I don't.
It's a chapter about I think it's joyful enlightenment or joyful spirituality, and basically he met with a friend of his who was really struggling with exactly this: envy, compare, and despair. And what she learned to do, or what she did, was pray for those people. But it was very specific. It was about, first of all, allowing yourself to experience what makes you joyful, and then wishing that for people. And there's sort of an arc in that. First is, you obviously want to wish that for people that you love, that you're closely connected to. That in itself is powerful. But then you start, wanting that, or wanting to connect with that on behalf of someone that maybe isn't so close to you, that you just have some peripheral engagement with. Then the next step is to do that with somebody that maybe you're envious of, or that's you're troubled at. But if what you're asking for is for them to be joyful and for them to have good things, what you're doing is you're shifting what's happening on the inside of you. And your experience of being with other people stops being that envy, because it doesn't have life anymore. And it even extends even further to people that you really just don't like at all. And this was something that is not new. This is a couple thousand years old. Pray for your enemies, turn the other cheek. That's really what all that's getting at, is that who are you going to be to these people? If who you're going to be is someone who's jealous and envious, okay, that comes naturally. Like resentment comes naturally. Fear comes naturally, because the world is a scary place. But a spiritual life is intervening in that. One really great way to overcome anger is curiosity. It's a very powerful way to overcome anger. Instead of being angry, why is this happening? That's very powerful, because then you start to learn. You get into a state where you're willing to learn. And what you may discover, first of all, often that your anger is unfounded or that you're just plain wrong. And it's good to find that out sooner rather than later, I think. But let me see if I can just get specifically the chapter name, because it really caught my attention, because having read the book before,
Okay, why don't you look at that and I'll play just an audio section from
Just
Johann
a little
Hari.
kid, so I didn't really understand
won't be
why.
able to-
As I got older,
Yeah, perfect.
You won't be able to hear it, but you can just interrupt me as
I
soon as
realized
you
we
find
had
the
drug
place.
addiction in my family, including
Okay.
later cocaine addiction. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, partly because it's now exactly 100 years since drugs were first banned in the United States and Britain, and we then imposed that on the rest of the world. It's a century since we made this really fateful decision to take addicts and punish them and make them suffer because we believed that would deter them, it would give them an incentive to stop. And a few years ago, I was looking at some of the addicts in my life who I love and trying to figure out if there was some way to help them. And I realized there were loads of incredibly basic questions I just didn't know the answer to. Like, what really causes addiction?
Okay.
Why do we carry on
Whenever
with
you're
this
ready,
approach that
come
doesn't
back
seem
up
to
Okay,
be
here.
one
working? And
second.
is there a
Okay, go ahead, Richard.
Okay, it's the chapter, it's entitled Sympathetic Joy, Chapter 20, Reconnection 5, Sympathetic Joy and Overcoming Addiction to Self. And it's really a story about him reconnecting with a friend of his, and she tells him, quite simply, sympathetic joy is a method for cultivating the opposite of jealousy or envy. It's simply feeling happy for other people. Rachel, which is his friend's name, guided me through how it works. The kind of meditation is about setting the intention to feel different, she told me, almost like saying, I want to feel different about you, and saying it enough times until you really do. I think it works on you below the level of ordinary consciousness. That's what she's getting at. And, that's, I hear that in 12-step room all the time. If you're resentful to somebody, pray for them for a couple of weeks, and you'll find out your resentment goes away. But prayer means that you're very intentional about what you're asking for, and usually the best intention is to ask for their highest good or for their well-being. See, because when we're jealous or when we're envious, we're not interested in their well-being. We're interested in ours at their expense. And to protect ourselves, we'll hurt them. And so often, obviously we know from experience, I know from experience, that's misguided, and it usually backfires and usually does destructive things to relationships and hurts not only myself and that person, but sometimes many other people too as well. It's not a good thing.
So on page 78 of Johann Hari's books, he mentioned that Hutterites have the lowest level of loneliness found anywhere in the world, at least according to one survey. I don't really know much about the Hutterites, except I believe they're a Christian sect, a little bit like the Amish and the Mennonites. Yeah. They trace their roots to the Radical Reformation in the early 16th century. So I'm going to assume that there's a tremendous amount of freedom that you have to give up if you want to live within Hutterite community. And so generally speaking, freedom and community are at intention. So if you want more freedom, you're generally going to have to give up more community. So for me, it's been a fine-tuning balance. I belong to the Orthodox Jewish community, but I'm willing to give up some connection to the community, some degree of communal solidarity, so that I have more freedom to say and explore the thoughts that are important to me. And also by doing that, I then get to connect with people who are similarly edgy. So when we say that connection's important, we don't mean that this is the one value that automatically supersedes all other values. Also, there are phone calls I get from chronically depressed people that I never return their calls. There are some people when they speak, I tune them out because I don't find tuning into them is worth what it does to me. So I'm not claiming that I'm just all about the connection everywhere I go. Often, if I've got a lot of tasks to do, then I'm going to be very oriented to just getting certain things done and not worrying about the connections that come along. I usually don't speak, for example, to my Uber driver beyond the absolute bare minimum. I've usually got other things going on. So I'm certainly not advocating that we make connection the number one value. I recognize that there is a tension between connection and freedom, and between getting certain tasks done and connecting with people. So any thoughts on these tensions?
Well, I want to bring it back to the Hari book in one example, and it's it's one of the areas where I think he maybe didn't pursue it as far as he could have. And in the conclusion of the book, he said, when I was a child, Margaret Thatcher said, there's no such thing as society, only individuals and their families. And all over the world, her viewpoint won. We believed it, even those of us who thought we rejected it. I know this now because I can see when I became depressed, it didn't even occur to me for 13 years to relate my stress to the world around me. Now, he's advocating for society, that society is more important. That if we want to change the fact that we have depression and they have anxiety, we have to change our society. That's really his advocacy. And he advocates things like universal basic income as an antidepressant. Which I find, you know, there's a lot to that, but I want to pursue this one quote because he took Margaret Thatcher out of context. And I actually looked for the article that he was quoting because it was actually an interview that she was quoted. And I think we've gone, and this is what she said in the interview, I think we've gone through a period when too many children and people have been given to understand, I have a problem, it is the government's job to cope with it, or I have a problem, I will go and get a grant to cope with it. I am homeless, the government must house me. And so they're casting their problems on society. And who is society? Well, there's no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and government can't do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first. It's our duty to look after ourselves and then also help to look after our neighbor. And life is a reciprocal business, and people have got the entitlements too much in mind without the obligations. Now, see, that's really actually talking about the balance that we've been talking about, and he avoids that.
Yeah.
He avoids that.
In the book, he makes the argument that we have adopted junk values. So if we have adopted junk values, and again, I don't think this is even a majority of people. I think this is a minority of people. I think a majority of people are fairly solid, that they're leading lives that basically work. But there is a distinct minority who have adopted junk values. But to the extent that we've adopted junk values in the 21st century, what did they supersede? Richard, any thoughts?
Well, it goes back to what he means by junk values, and I think I think it's more pervasive than you just suggested. I think that the value of materialism and the value of, you know, you are what you own runs much deeper in our society, in America, and in Europe also, and much more subtly, and on deeper levels. It affects the workplace. It affects a lot of different things. But what's, you know, the Judeo-Christian values are the values that we've traded for these junk values. And what he's advocating for, really, although he would never admit to it because he's radically against that, he claims to be an atheist, and yet so many of the principles that are inherent in that worldview are exactly the thing that he advocates. And you know, you can sort of trace it from the start of the Enlightenment. There was this break, you know, from what we would probably want to call humility and, you know, a sense of our right-sized, how to be right-sized and how to be humble, that we lost. And also that, you know, you mentioned about the connection to nature, and I think that's a bigger conversation too. But to really look at this, the values that we have, what is important? Well, other people are important. Why are they important? Well, I would argue, and I often argue, that what religion is teaches us is a framework for getting along with other people. The problem is most of the practice of religion simply doesn't go deep enough, doesn't get to these very areas that we're talking about right now. Like, how do we deal with anxiety and depression when it goes off the rails in the world around us, as it is right now? Clearly it is. And though I would agree that the values of materialism are fairly dominant. You look at Facebook, you see it. You look at young people today, you see there's a lot of that. There's counterbalance to that. It's not a sweeping statement that everybody operates that way. And there's really multiple currents in our society. But still, the pervasive value in our society has been, one of materialism. And if you look in the scientific community, it's scientific materialism. It's, your consciousness is only what's going on in the bubbling and fizzing of your brain. That once that's gone, that there's nothing. And well, that may or may not be true. They don't know, and really nobody can prove it.
I remember one Friday night I was at Temple, and the mayor of Los Angeles, Antonio Villaraigosa, came to speak to us, and he had some life advice. He said, get out there and talk to someone who doesn't speak your language. And it was the most ridiculous thing in the world. You literally cannot talk to someone if you don't share a common language. And so much of the dislocation that we're seeing, disconnection, the reduced levels of social trust and social cohesion, is that we have a lot of people in the country now who don't speak our language. We are no longer a dominantly Christian nation, that we increasingly have less in common. So all the celebration of diversity, it's really saying the less that people have in common, the less that Americans have in common, the better. And to me, that doesn't make sense, and it does not make for normal human connection. Any thoughts?
Well, yeah, that's a complex issue. And, again, it goes back to this balancing act that we have to balance our individualism with the value of other people. We have to value ourselves, but we have to have equal value for other people. Not greater. One should not be greater than the other. They should have a collaborative connection that is powerful. Now, I've seen how that can work. I've seen how that can work in my own business settings, where when I started a business. It was a special events planning firm, and my invitation to people was, let's get together and we're each going to create our own jobs. I was not the boss. I was really sort of a coordinator. Now, I was the boss. I mean, I signed the checks and stuff. Man, I had a partner, or who became my partner over time. But I was dead serious about that invitation, and it worked. It worked brilliantly. What we would do is we would get together in a room and we would brainstorm. And the rules in those brainstorms, anybody can say anything, and we'll listen, and we'll toss it around and we'll play with it. And we'll see where it goes, and honor it. And it was so powerful, and it was fun, and we enjoyed each other tremendously in the process of doing that. And that's the place where you both honor what you're doing collectively, but you value the individual and their unique contribution in a very particular way. Hariam in the book talks about, in the supposed corporate workplace, keep your head down and do what you're told. If you come up with an idea, I'm sorry, your idea doesn't mean anything. Just do what you're told. That's the argument he makes, that it isn't a good thing. And I agree, that's not a good thing. And I've worked in companies like that, and it's not fun. And I didn't want to stay there. And certainly that idea is shifting. There's plenty of companies that are taking a very different route to how they deal with that.
Now
But
let's take your example. How would your example work if people didn't speak the same language?
yeah, good question. You'd have to learn how to communicate with them because you would have to value communicating with them sufficiently to actually learn something that you don't already know. And that's to me where the value is. And I think that muscle, it's one thing to learn another language, but that goes on to multiple levels. That goes on to cultural levels. That goes on to intellectual levels of knowledge and education. There's a whole lot of levels that goes on to. And so, thanks for bringing that back, because that is such a key point, because we have to. Here's the way I'm putting it in the book. In my book, I'm saying, we used to say you need to walk a mile in the other man's shoes. Well, I think that was fine, 300 years ago. But today, I think we have to learn to walk the miles in each other's shoes, because that's where the real value is. We have to be willing to learn. Now, you brought up a really good point earlier. You said you can't do that for everybody, and there's limits to what you can do. There's some people you don't want to let in. You have to be honest with that. Boundaries are important, and they're healthy. On the other hand, there's this idea of idea deflection. When somebody gives you a suggestion, you go, well, no, you don't even consider it. See, I think we need to learn to consider things more. And I think that's healthy. And I think that includes considering people who think about things differently than we do, maybe who even speak a different language than we do. Now, obviously, there's realities of time and availability and all those things that have to factor into that. And that's a balancing act. But I think the willingness to do that is actually helpful, because I think it translates into more than just, dealing with somebody who doesn't speak your language, because there's a lot of languages we speak. And I'm not talking about the verbal language. I'm talking about a lot of ways we communicate. And if we learn how other people communicate, that's important. That's important too. That's a facility that I think is very important to develop.
Okay, let me give you a gut check reaction. What you're talking about sounds exhausting. So what you and I have, we've been friends for years, is a virtually friction-free friendship. So we know when we're speaking, we know even a format for regular conversations. We both put a prize on timeliness, even though I, in particular, have been a little inconsistent on that. But overall, our friendship.
I'm not going to let you get away with that. You're good about that.
Okay, thank you. But our friendship is overall like really low in friction, and frankly, I don't have that much energy. So when I like boundaries. I've been accused of not being terribly flexible, and there's a great deal of truth to it. So I guess we have to be aware of how much energy we have, and if we want to expend it on like some of these exhausting connections with people who are very different from us, I gotta say I would just find a lot of that exhausting. I'm going to choose instead to spend most of my time and energy with people with whom there's a low level of friction. And so, for example, I would not participate in committees. I'm a big believer in volunteering, but I only do those volunteering jobs where the task is clear and I simply fulfill the task. I would not participate in committees. It's not suited to my personality. What are your thoughts on my gut check reaction that much of what you're laying out just sounds absolutely exhausting?
Well, let me ask you a question. And have you done a Myers-Briggs test?
Yeah, one, I think it's bunk, but two, I'm an INTJ.
Okay, so you're an introvert. That makes perfect sense, because that kind of that kind of milieu of relating to people is exhausting to an introvert. Introverts get drained by other people. They have to go back into their privacy to recharge. So that makes perfect sense. My wife's an introvert, and even though she's very gregarious, as you are, we say everything introverted means. Oh well, I'm happy, I'm gregarious, I'm loud, enthusiastic. No, it has nothing to do with it. It has to do with how you relate to other people on an energetic level. As an extrovert, I get recharged in my relationships and connections with other people. That's exactly the opposite for an introvert. An introvert gets drained by those interactions. Now, here's the thing. An introvert is not better than an extrovert in the area of relationships. They're different. See, and it's accounting for the difference that I think is really the heart of what is interesting to me. You being an introvert, we get along. It's frictionless, and that's because we just enjoy each other. We have a lot of things in common. We enjoy talking. We enjoy many of the same topics. That's just natural, and that's a gift. I think friendship is a gift. It's not something we're entitled to. And the thing is, many of the relationships we have, I'm not going to say most, but many of the relationships that we have, let's use the workplace. We have to get along with people that we're thrown in with sometimes. And that's where that skill comes in.
Now, here's something else in reaction to some of the things you said. I find that the taller the walls and the stronger the boundaries, the more relaxed and easy the connection. So, for example, that's primarily within Orthodox Judaism. When I go to my Orthodox synagogue and related functions and friends and connections that I have in that community, like there are so many boundaries that don't need to be explained, that just are taken for granted. There's not a whole lot of negotiating that needs to be done. There's just certain agreed upon ways that we operate, and it's then just frees up human connection. It just provides a sense of ease with each other, very low friction human connection, as opposed to negotiating, let's just say, with a Japanese American, a Mexican American, an African American, an Anglo American, and I don't know, an Egyptian American. That the prospects of that just tire me out. So I really like the joys of being in a community with really tall, thick walls, really, really solid boundaries, because then I can let my hair down. I mean, human connection is effortless. You don't have to negotiate. You don't have to, agree on things. It's just all laid out. And so that for me is like the easiest, the most pleasing, the most immediate, the most fulfilling, regular forms of human connection I have, where really tall walls, really thick boundaries, fairly strict rules where we all agree to abide by them. And then the benefit of that is that I can be completely myself within those boundaries. I don't have to worry about offending anyone. I don't have to worry about impressing anyone. I don't have to worry about anything, because then human interaction is just effortless and people are genuine, because we're not trying to accommodate all these, differences. That we're in our own little insular community, and we all agree on the basics. So I don't know if there's anything there you want to comment on.
Well, that's the whole purpose of culture, isn't it? To create a framework for behavior, how we behave with each other. Isn't that what culture is?
Yeah.
So there's a value in culture. But the reality is the human family, the human species, we create culture all over the place, and there's all these different cultures. Now Now let me ask you a question this way. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that perspective. I think that's useful. I mean, I certainly seek out places where I don't have to explain myself or question, that I can just kind of be with people who value the same things I do, who honor the same things I do, who, for the most part, want most of the things that I want, in terms of, from relationships and from life and things like that. It's wonderful to be in that. That is, we all need that. That's what makes for a healthy community. On the other hand, the danger of that is you can become very narrowed by that. Yes, the narrowness has a benefit, and you're right, and you're absolutely right about the benefit. It removes so much of the friction and negotiation that is part of human relationships. It sort of gets that done ahead of time. So you just get that out of the way. It's out of the way, it's done. That's a good thing. But learning a language other than your own language has the effect of giving you deeper insight as to your own language and what it means, and it gives you deeper insight to it. And I think that's what can be lost in that very narrow controlled community. That can be lost. The growth can actually be lost. There's anthropologists can talk about that, and I'm not going to try to get too much into that because that's a little bit of a bunny trail. But the innovators are very, very important to a healthy society, because societies tend to ossify around certain ideas, and then they get stuck, and then they crumble because they don't grow. A classic example. There was a group of, I want to say it's a group of Vikings who became Christian, who there was I want to say it was in Greenland, and I could be mistaken about this, but when the weather started to change, they stopped being able to farm, but they would not abandon their values, and they died. Their little society died out because they wouldn't learn from the Eskimos, who were very adept at hunting in a colder climate, because they're terrible, they're wrong, they're bad, they're evil. Okay, well, that was a choice that they made, but that's one of the consequences of that narrowness, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a good point. So one of the best ways I've found in recent years to connect with other people is through volunteering. So I volunteer up to about 15 hours a week, and having a common purpose is incredibly helpful for connecting people. And as government takes up more and more space that used to be filled by volunteering, I think that creates a sense of loneliness and dislocation and disconnection. Any thoughts?
I'm not sure I understand. So is the question about the effect of government, or I'm not sure what the question is.
Okay, so volunteering, I'm sure you agree, is an excellent way of connecting people. So
Yeah.
it connects you to the people you help, and it connects you to your wider community who appreciate your good work. And we have an increasingly growing government that is increasingly taking over many aspects of life that used to be handled by volunteering. So you can talk about the benefits of volunteering, or you can talk about the dislocating effects of big government reducing these formerly strong bonds between people, whether it's the person who is being helped or the person who is helping.
Okay. Well, now the question is, what is really driving that? Is it is it the government imposing it, or is it people relinquishing the willingness to be that, to have that level of responsibility with people around them? I think that's the heart of the question there, because I think, at least in Hari's book, I think he makes the case that it is our society that is enforcing that, and we need to change our society. So in that case, the government is the problem. Well, Ronald Reagan said that. You know, government is the problem. And part of the problem of government doing things as opposed to communities doing things is that you have a bureaucrat, 1,000 miles away or 2,000 miles away, trying to make decisions about something in a community, where someone in that community is going to have a much better idea of what's going to be effective. And so the possibilities for waste and fraud and mistakes and doing more harm than good, which often happens in situations where things are managed from a distance. I think that's something that's being lost. That's certainly as a conservative value, we like to fight for, the fact that, don't let the government take this over. The churches will do it. But here's the problem: the churches aren't doing it. The volunteers aren't showing up, and government's filling the gap. So how do we deal with that? Because people are overwhelmed, people are depressed, people are, anxious, and they can't get past themselves to show up and volunteer. Where of course, showing up and volunteering would have a profound impact on that very anxiety and depression. But you'd be surprised, people don't get that.
How have you been able to calibrate an appropriate level of volunteering in your life? And I'll just share my own. So I've had a tendency to over volunteer, to take on more than I could chew, and that obviously didn't serve me and other people. And then finding limited abilities to volunteer that I enjoy. So often I have associated volunteering with doing stuff that I hate. And so instead I've been able to find wiser means of volunteering, so that I'm doing things that I'm more likely to enjoy, and also making sure that I limit the number of hours that I spend. So those have been helpful. So prior to the last few years, I would go back and forth between spending way too much time volunteering, getting exhausted and annoyed, or completely cutting out volunteering so that I could, say, focus laser-like on my vision, but then missing out on many opportunities for human connection. And so how have you calibrated the right amount of volunteering?
That's such a great question. And it's not a static thing. In my experience, it's not static at all. It's something that's ongoing. It's an ongoing evaluation. But there's some big rocks in the Stephen Covey sense. There's some big rocks that form priorities for me. Some of my volunteering is in my spiritual communities. I'm of service on a world service level in 12-step fellowship. I sponsor people. I've helped to start meetings, and that's all volunteer. But those are all things that interest me. And so I volunteer around the things that actually connect with my life. Now, I happen to think that the work I've done in recovery, the work I've done in getting to know myself, in getting myself in right relationship to myself and to the people around me, and to my higher power and to God, and the best way I can put it is the way King David put it. He said, God, I'll delight myself in you, and you will give me the desires of my heart. That's a way that I understand that, and I'll explain that. It doesn't mean that if I just go to church, that God's going to be this cosmic genie who's going to give me what I want. What it means is that in pursuing a spiritual life, my desires are going to change. The things I want are going to change. And I'm going to want the things that will fulfill me. And so that's to me, that's sort of the anchor of that whole setting of priorities, because the opportunities then present themselves. I don't have to go searching for it. I don't have to go hunting for it. The opportunity is actually presented to me because that's who I am. And we draw to ourselves what we are. I think that is a fundamental truth, that we attract based on who we are. We attract other people who are like us.
So you know many people who have achieved quite a bit of success in the worlds of music and the worlds of writing, and then other people they have a real hard time when their friends excel them. That it really bothers them. I know one person in my life, and it really bothers her that her best friend has achieved at 10 times the rate that she has, and then doesn't do anything to assist my friend. And so I'm just curious, how have you been able to deal with having friends who excel you?
I
in certain
enjoy the fact
areas?
that I enjoy the fact that they're doing good things. The way I look at it is I enjoy what God is doing in their lives. And what it shows me is that it's possible. And the thing about it, you know, this whole thing about envy it's a lack of self-acceptance in my experience. Envy is about not accepting myself as who I am. And so in order to be okay, I have to be, I'll be like that, and then I'll be okay because he's accepted, and I like the way that looks, and I like the way that feels. But when I have come to a place, which I have, I feel like I've arrived at a place in my life. And of course, you know, recovery isn't about arriving; it's about aligning. But I've kind of aligned myself to in this place where where I know what's important to me, and I'm comfortable with it. I'm comfortable in my own skin. I'm comfortable with who I am, with the limits that that presents, because it does. You know, when I was growing up, I had you know, as a musician, I have a dexterous hand. I have long fingers, but it's not a big hand. And I had a friend who had a huge hand, and I can't reach that much on the piano. You can reach more than I can. Well, but you know, one of the things my teacher showed me was that Chopin had a small hand too, and he learned to deal with that. So he did a lot of arpeggios and a lot of things that he was good at because of his own natural limitations. Those, we call them limitations, but they're really the opportunities to find who we are, that's unique and different from what everybody else is. And I think Oscar Wilde put it really well. There's no sense in being somebody else. That job's already taken. And that's from the play The Importance of Being Earnest. There's a play about Ernest. And I think he makes the point, you know, the most important thing you can learn to do is to really be who you are and be comfortable with that. When you are comfortable with that, then a lot of that stuff goes away. And I think that's a lot of the work of recovery is coming to terms with that, and coming to terms with all the wrong directions we've tried to head ourselves in order to be okay in life. But we learn that we don't have to do it that way. You know, we can be who we are and be at ease with that. That is one of the reasons that I say is that prosperity is really different for everybody. Prosperity has nothing to do with your bank account, because for some people, prosperity can look like, you know, a 5-figure income. For some, it's going to be a 6-figure income. For some, it's going to be 7 figures. For some, it's going to be 12 figures. It has nothing to do with anything other than, you know, I've known people who've made lots of money who destroy themselves, and I know people who make don't make that much money, but they have a very prosperous and abundant life. And it has to do with what's going on the inside, not what's going on the outside. See, I think
He
that
also, sorry, go ahead.
no, that's that. I've gone on too long on that anyway.
Okay, so he also talks about the importance of exercise. I find I get many of my best thoughts while I'm out for a walk. I also get new perspectives on life. So obviously, exercise is essential uh, for staying attuned to life. I mean, we were not built to just sit around all day. Do you have any thoughts on the role that exercise has played in your recovery?
Oh, I like to hike, and I run half marathons, and I do some kind of exercise every day, but I've gotten back into hiking regularly, and that can be anywhere from an hour or two just out in nature, which has many benefits to it. Being out in nature is beneficial in itself. In fact, we hadn't really got to that from the Hari book, where he talks about how important it is to feel that connection to nature, and I agree with that. And I was talking to my producer, and I was saying, yeah, I'm going to take my songs out for a hike. And literally, I took my phone and my headphones, and I had the tracks I was listening to, and I just went on a hike and I just listened to them and I just played them and I just let that complete change of scene and everything just open up creative avenues. So I think there's a lot of ways in which being physical and being reconnected with my body, and just getting grounded in reality, because this space in between here is not necessarily grounded in reality. And if you spend too much time here, I like to think of this neighborhood between my ears as a dangerous neighborhood, and if I hang out there too much, I'm going to get mugged.
Hmm. As we come towards the end of the stream, why don't you say something about your book?
Well, at this point, I think I said mostly what I want to say. But for me, the key to it is, and I started to read. Coming back to the Hari book really kind of brought me back to some of the core issues that that it's about, which is really how we collaborate, and how we find ways to do that, and how we build the capacity to collaborate, because it's a capacity you have to build. But the main argument of the book is that and it started for me from a blurt at a 12-step conference where I was with, we just come out of a committee meeting, and committee meetings can be very difficult. And, there was one guy who really just got completely bent out of shape by the committee meeting. And you guys are crazy, and we should have done this and we should have done that. And I'm going to leave the conference. I'm done. I'm going home. And we let him talk. And, he just wasn't used to that process and didn't like it. And I was the vice chair of the committee, and the chair of the committee basically said, well, you got to learn to trust the process. And I said, yeah, you need to learn to love the nine-legged sack race. And really, it's about the gifts we give each other and whether we're willing to receive them or not, because there's a lot there. And I think we have to cultivate the willingness and the capacity to receive that. It's not natural. It does not come naturally to anybody, in my opinion. Some people maybe have a more inclination. And I think, visiting what we were talking about before, I think extroverts may have a little bit more inclination, but trust me, I still had to learn that. And over a very long period of time, bumping into a lot of very ugly walls.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's the thought there.
Okay, so there's a great point in this book about the importance of nature. So I love swimming in the ocean. So swimming offshore, sometimes I'll swim half a mile or more offshore. That really gives me kind of a sense of a more appropriate sense of my place in the universe. Or I remember one of the most spiritual experiences that I've had in the last 20 years was going to Yosemite. like turning the corner, and then the absolute grandeur of Yosemite is laid out in front of me, and it just takes my breath away. It reminds you of a more appropriate sense of one's own place in the universe, and it's humbling in a good way. It's like a pleasant cold shower. It's reorienting, and one senses, the grandeur of nature is bigger than you. So even just taking in a beautiful sunrise or sunset, we've had so many beautiful sunrises and sunsets in Los Angeles over the past few weeks. If we can tune into nature, that's a great way of getting a sense of perspective. Any thoughts?
Well, that's such a, yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about that. I don't know how much time we have, and I don't want to start something we can't finish. But, you know, that to me, that's a double-edged sword. And I enjoy nature, but I'm remembering a conversation I had with somebody who was telling me, I find God out in the woods and everything else. And I went, well, I know that that's true because there is that awe, there is that perspective, there is that grandeur. But and not, I don't want to say but, and the thing is, I asked, and this is the question I asked him, can you find that same awe in traffic, in in a city, in your workplace? Because that's where it counts. It's nice to experience it by yourself and receive that. And I think there's a lot of research about the value of green spaces and the value of connection to nature. And I agree with them, by the way. And we live in a world full of people. We live in urban environments. How do we bring that connection into those settings? That's the heart of what the book is for me. The book that I'm writing is about ways that we do that. And I think we have a lot of that, but we don't see it that way. We want to escape it because it's sometimes, like you said it yourself, it sounds exhausting. And for everybody's different in their appetite and their capacity for that, I think. And coming to terms with what that is perfectly acceptable. There's no one right answer for anybody. At least I don't think there is. I haven't found one. And I found every individual has a unique capacity. I like the example of snowflakes, because when you think about it, from a distance, all snowflakes look pretty much the same. But when you get really close, they are all vastly different. And I think human beings are exactly the same way. And I happen to have an appetite for appreciating that diversity. I just have an appetite for that. And now maybe it's one I've cultivated, and I would say that that's true. I've cultivated an appreciation for that. In fact, I seek out friends that I disagree with. And some of my best friends, I'm thinking of one guy who lives in Maryland. We are politically as far apart as we can be, but we just love talking with each other because we listen to each other. And we learn from our differences more than we adopt the you're wrong and I've got to be right and I've got to change your mind mentality that we so often bring to people we disagree with. Instead of really realizing that it's an opportunity to learn and to actually be better at what we do from learning from somebody that has a perspective that we would not normally adopt or would not normally consider.
And speaking of traffic, it's so important to me to not get stuck in traffic. I've always designed my life so I don't have a regular commute longer than 20 minutes. I mean, even in Los Angeles, I really don't want to be trying to find God in traffic. That's my preference.
But you can, and actually, that's an area where I practice, where I have practiced in the past. Driving for Uber, I sort of had to do that, but it was really a deliberate choice to train myself to not respond to it negatively, but to grant that everybody has a right to be where they are, that acceptance is the answer to all my problems. It's part of what, to me, it's part of what makes Los Angeles such an amazing place is that you have all these people that are going all these places, that are doing all these things. That's what makes this an amazing place to be. And of course, with that comes traffic. And of the hundreds, and I mean literally hundreds of conversations I've had with people about traffic, most people take your attitude. Most people, hate traffic, don't want to deal with it, don't want to have it. It'll be interesting where that tends to go as we learn to deal with urban environments more, because urban environments bring that with it. And whether they bring it in traffic with automobiles, they bring it in traffic with other people in ways that it's beneficial when we can learn to do that, and to honor what you said, because you have a capacity that's going to be different from mine. I have more of an appetite for that. You have less of an appetite for that. Finding that right balance for you is going to be really essential. Because I think as some of the tasks that we do now, some of the work that we do now, as that gets offloaded to robots and artificial intelligence, we're going to be confronted with more and more human jobs that require human interaction and human creativity. I think that's where we're headed as a species. So I think it's very important to learn to adopt that.
And here's one paragraph from the book. The biologist E.O. Wilson argued that all humans have a natural sense of something called biophilia. It's an innate love for the landscape in which humans have lived for most of our existence, for the natural web of life that surrounds us, makes our existence possible. Almost all animals get distressed if they are deprived of the kinds of landscapes that they evolved to live in. I would just translate, it's so essential to find a place for you. That I love living in Los Angeles, but I know that for other people, living in Los Angeles would be hell.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Just one point on this, because it's such a good point, and I agree with that. However, we are a cultural communal species. When you look at ants, they are a cultural communal species. What do? They build habitats that they share. Bees are the same way. They're cultural beings. They're a little civilization unto themselves. What do? They build a habitat that's uniquely suited to what they need. That's what cities are for us. They're uniquely suited to what we need. But, and I make the argument, frankly, that we're designed to create civilization the way that we are. That's what we're here. That's innate within us. The ability to create civilization is part and parcel of human capacities, and bees build hives, we build cities.
Did you learn anything about yourself or about connecting with other people when you were driving for Uber? And for example, more than 90% of the time, I don't want to have more than the minimal interaction with my Uber driver. I've got phone calls to make, or an audiobook to listen to, etc. So I'm just curious if you learned anything about yourself and anything about human connection from your experience driving for Uber.
Well, I had a lot of amazing conversations, and I also had a lot of situations where someone got in the car and I just drove them where they needed to go, and there was no interaction, and I was equally comfortable in both settings, in both situations, because my concern was that the person in getting into my car would have a great experience. And part of that has to do not with what I think that experience should be, but has to do with what experience they're willing to have, and just really hearing that and being comfortable with that, being comfortable with whatever it is, whether it's someone who just wants to sit there and be on the phone and ignore me like I don't exist, and that happened. Yeah, I noticed two kinds of millennials. There are millennials who get in the car and the Uber driver isn't even there. They're so engaged in their conversation that there's nothing else in the world but that conversation. And I was literally a non-entity in their perspective. That didn't bother me. I would learn from listening to their conversation. I learned a lot of things about people from that. Just listening and not having any upset about, gee, they don't want to talk about what I want to talk about, or they don't want to have a conversation with me. Now, I might have rated them, differently as a result of that, because we were able to give them ratings. But I had people get in the car who just wanted to talk, and I would talk with them. I had one young woman get in the car. She had just found her boyfriend and her best girlfriend, her BFF, in bed together. And her mother called her an Uber, and she was going to her mother's house. And I just got a chance to be with someone who was really in a very vulnerable place, and I considered it a great honor to be able to do that. So I mean, I learned a lot of things. I could spend 2 hours just on what I learned from that.
What kind of music would you have playing in the car, if any?
Usually, I would play classical music. That would be a default. Usually, string quartets. Now, sometimes people would say, "Hey, can you change the music?" And I said, "What would you like?"
Yeah.
Or every once in a while, that kind of music bothers people and say, "Can we not have music?" And I said, "Of course." It was always fine. But most people, surprisingly, 80% of people just loved it because they said it just really elevated the atmosphere. And I found that to be true. That was one of the reasons I did it, is because it spoke of a time when people were more patient. It was generated in a time where human beings were more inclined to be patient with things than we are now. So I think it helped to enhance that. That probably had something to do with why I made my peace with our beloved traffic.
And any criticisms or reservations you'd like to add before we wind up?
Add about criticism or reservations about
the book by Johann Hari.
The one I mentioned about, the fact that he took Thatcher's remark out of context, and he really has a clear agenda. But I don't altogether disagree with the agenda that he has. I just think his conversation is too narrow to really be an accommodating one. I think he would have difficulty with someone who disagreed with him.
Well,
here's a point. He talks about his experience with Kentucky Fried Chicken, and he went into Kentucky Fried Chicken, and he was given a Christmas card by everyone, and every employee signed it. So you're our best customer. You know what he said? I never went back to KFC again. That's a really interesting response to people who are sharing their appreciation of you. Now, maybe he obviously didn't like that, but that's a very interesting response. And there are other places where that kind of character shows up. And that's not the kind of character I try to develop. But that's personal. It's like, yeah, so what? That's what he did, and he was honest about it, and I respect that. And I highly respect his honesty, even when I don't agree with his choices.
I have strong disagreements with many people's choices. What if I consider that the way somebody's leading their life is an abomination? How do I interact with such people?
Maybe you don't.
Well, in today's world, you have to interact with many people who have a way of life that you find abominable. So how do you interact with people who have a way of living that you find abominable?
Well, they're responsible for their lifestyle, not me. The thing, the only concern I would have is, if too much of that spills over onto me and creates problems, then it has to be dealt with. And, some people I just don't deal with. But, my philosophy is it's damn hard to be a human being. And we're all of us, dealing with struggling to get along in this thing called life. And I find that, as I get to know people that I find that disagreement with, I find I can, it doesn't necessarily mean that I accept what they do. Johann Hari, for example, is gay. Now, I know lots of gay people. I don't dislike gay people, but I don't necessarily seek them out as friends. It's not gay bashing. It's just I don't have that much in common with them. That being said, I do have some, and I value those friendships, the ones that I do have. But it's not something I seek out. There are some people I'm going to get along with, and there's some people I'm not going to get along with. And I think just being clear about that and honoring myself and the other person is probably the approach that I take that seems to work best for me.
Well, how do we interact with people who regard us as subhuman because of our political orientation?
That's a good question. There's going to be two kinds of people, generally speaking, that fall into that category. There's going to be one kind that's opinionated but is teachable. There's going to be the other kind that just is not interested in anything but their opinion. And you just kind of got to give those, as much as possible, give those people a wide berth. And if they're in the workplace, well, sometimes it means you have to change the workplace if there are too many of them.
Okay, great. Any final words for today, Richard?
I think you should have the last word there, Luke.
Okay, so I'm just going to play a song, which you're probably not going to be able to hear due to the headphone setup. So I strongly recommend the book. It's called Lost Connections, Why You Were Depressed and How to Find Hope. And I'm going to play a little song here. And thanks for watching, everyone. Thanks, Richard. Good to talk to you, my friend.
What song are you going to play?
You're not going to be able to hear it, but it's A Bridge Over Troubled Water.
Okay, great. Perfect.
Take care, my friend. Bye-bye.
All right, you have a beautiful rest of the day, and thank you for the invitation.
You're welcome.